For more on the fighting in eastern Ukraine and diplomatic efforts to end it, I'm joined by James Jatras, Deputy Director for the American Institute in Ukraine. First, let me just kind of back up. Let's talk about the talks. Merkel and Hollande meeting with Putin. I mean, if you were to read body language, the two of them didn't look all that enthusiastic going into the meeting with Putin. They leave. Merkel comes to Washington. She meets with Obama. What do you make of all these talks?
What I make of it primarily is that Mrs. Merkel and the Europeans are in a desperate position. They have walked up to the edge of the cliff with American policy on sanctions and so forth, and now it's got no place to go. And now they hear Washington wants to up the ante by sending weapons into Ukraine. And I think the Europeans see that that would be a disaster for them. So I don't think they know which way to jump. And I think, in fact, all of this talk about sending weapons into Ukraine is largely to put pressure on the Europeans to stick with American policy.
You say it's a disaster. Why?
Because you can't have a settlement of a war just based on let's have a ceasefire. You have to have a political solution. And the political solution has got to be both internally within Ukraine about what the status of the eastern oblasts will be, and it also has to be internationally having to do with Ukraine's status between Europe on the one hand and NATO and the European Union and Russia on the other hand. And there's simply no agreement on those issues and no sense that anybody on the Western side is going to put an agreement on the table that the people in eastern Ukraine or the Russians can accept.
What about the people who say, look, this diplomatic solution, everybody's been seeking that for a long time, that Putin really has put the vice grips on Ukraine. Now it's time for the West to do the same sort of thing, injecting the weapons. Maybe we'll put pressure on him to come to the table and negotiate. What about the people who make that argument?
I think it's a terrible idea because on its face it can't work. There's simply not enough political commitment, especially since nobody, even the wildest hawks don't dream of putting American or NATO forces into Ukraine. Nobody believes that putting those weapons into the hands of the Kiev forces can actually reverse their military fortunes. They just argue it'll make the Russians pay a higher cost. But on their own doorstep, they can escalate infinitely. And the question is, we can't outbid them when it comes to security assistance to Ukraine. All that will result in is more dead Ukrainians.
What about Minsk? What's going to happen there this week? What's the optimum we can expect? I know the status quo is what we normally get, but what do you think can come out of it?
The optimum would be if the Europeans finally decide that following Washington's lead on this is destroying their interests, and they say, we're out of here. We're going to cut a deal with the Russians and get the Europeans, the Kiev forces and the Eastern forces to come to an internal agreement and stop listening to people in Washington. As long as they are listening to people in Washington and making this a confrontational thing all about Russia, the Europeans are in an impossible position. That they could conceivably do, but it would be it would require some real courage on the part of the European leaders.
Talk to me about what you're hearing from people that you're talking to in Kiev.
It's very, very sad when I hear people talk in Kiev, even people who are very patriotic Ukrainians, who are very anti-Russian, who believe in their side of the argument. And by the way, not everybody in Ukraine is of that point of view. Even they are just appalled at the level of leadership they have, the absence of strategy, the fact that people are being thrown into a meat grinder in eastern Ukraine, that they're being used as cannon fodder. They're drafting women now, and of course the economy is in complete collapse.
And drafting has not been very successful.
Not successful. I've read somewhere that it's approximately a 6% compliance rate that they're having now. I saw a video of a woman in Zaporozhye, which is not even in eastern Ukraine, just threatening the recruiting officers. Nobody from this town will go. If you try to take people from here, we will defend ourselves.
Let me ask you one final question, and this is the supposition that a lot of people have that Putin has managed to drive a wedge in between Europe and the U.S. And I want to go back to Jack Barton's report because the Spanish minister said that the current sanctions have cost the bloc itself $24 billion. They're definitely against further sanctions. How much of this is going to really weaken the resolve of the Europeans, and how long before this thing kind of fragments, like you're describing?
That's the other side that's whipsawing Merkel and the Germans in particular, is the crisis that the European Union finds itself over the status of the euro, the Greeks, the Spaniards, the Italians, and so forth, the growing dissension within European ranks. Not only are Europe and America not united, Europe is not united. At the same time, they're facing their own internal financial crisis. The last thing they need is to get frog-marched into a further confrontation with the Russians, not only sanctions, but turning up the heat by stoking it with weapons.
James Jatras, always a delight having you on our broadcast. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.